I'll go first with the gentleman in the white shirt over there.
Michael Dillon, and my question is to Kieran Tapsell. A number of years ago, I cannot give you the precise date, the Irish Prime Minister recalled the papal nuncio due to the fact that the Vatican instructed the Irish Catholic Church not to cooperate with the Irish government in terms of I think it was the commission was still running at the time. That's the first part of the question. That's part of the preamble for the question. The question is that the Irish Royal Commission had one major flaw, and that is that it was unable to prosecute. And I know for a start that the Christian brothers were quite prepared to hand over any documents as long as their clergy were immune from prosecution. And that was one of the biggest pieces of advice that the Irish had to the Australian Royal Commission, and that is that will they be able to prosecute? So if you could comment on that, please.
Well, firstly, no Royal Commission prosecutes. I don't think even in Ireland. They don't call them Royal Commissions, of course, they just call them commissions. But no Royal Commission here prosecutes. It makes recommendations. So it's not a question of prosecuting. I think what you're getting at, is that the Murphy Commission asked the Vatican to produce its documents, and it refused because it said it was an independent country and they had to go through some particular diplomatic procedures, which they said they didn't do. It's interesting now that Cardinal Pell said that all documents would be available to the Royal Commission. I think he said that down in Victoria at the parliamentary inquiry. Justice McClellan asked them to produce it, and just in June, I've forgotten the date, he said that they had produced some documents, but they were not prepared to produce other documents because they are an independent state, and independent states have a right to keep all these things confidential. Now, what I think is amazing about this is, on the one hand, as you heard, they said that under the Convention of the Trial, Convention of the Rights of the Child, they only have this obligation to the handful of children within the Vatican City. And that's because it is an independent state and that's who they look after. What the Royal Commission was asking was not to see the documents about priests who had been sexually abusing the children of the Swiss Guards. It was asking to see documents about priests here in Australia who had been abusing Australian children. Now, that has got absolutely nothing to do with the Vatican as an independent state. It has everything to do with the Holy See, which claims a jurisdiction over all Catholics to impose canon law. Now, I just think that's inexcusable if they've done that.
Before you go, Ian, did you want to make a comment or...?
I may not have followed correctly, but I'd be wondering what documents the Holy See would have that wouldn't be, for example, if something had occurred in Melbourne, what's being suggested, that every skerrick of paper was sent to the Vatican so there'd be nothing here. I would think if an investigation had occurred here, the records would be here. The only thing that would go to the Vatican is something that had been perpetrated by a cleric. A cleric is a bishop, a priest or a deacon. Everyone else in the church is a lay person. So Christian brothers are not clerics because they're not ordained bishops, priests or deacons. They are religious, but they are lay religious. Some religious are clerics. For example, Jesuit priests are clerical religious. The other Sisters of Mercy and Christian brothers are lay religious. The only thing that the Vatican insists be referred to it, and that's only in recent decades, is the crime of pedophilia by a cleric. That's only been required since, I think, 2001. Now, the Vatican perhaps would have a copy of any investigation, or if it did it itself, and I understand the praxis is, a diocese, the law since 2001 has been, if a bishop becomes aware of a crime conducted by a cleric dealing with pedophilia, he is to refer the matter to the Holy See and wait for instructions. The Holy See normally makes a judgment as to whether there are local resources to be able to set up an ecclesiastical court to judge it in that country, which is perhaps likely to happen in Australia. But if it happened in a place like, for example, Tonga, I presume where they wouldn't have the resources and personnel to set up an ecclesiastical court, the Vatican would judge it itself. If such a thing did happen in Australia, I presume if the Vatican, there'd be correspondence about that would go to the Vatican, and at the end the Vatican would require the decision, or perhaps even the full acts of the process. But the originals would be in the originating tribunal, and I can't see why the Royal Commission would not subpoena it directly from the Diocese of Melbourne, why it would need to go through the Apostolic See, where it has to face all those rules about international diplomacy. Now, I'm not an expert on international diplomacy, but you and I know that once you enter that world, that's all governed by the Congress of Vienna and the Congress of something else back to 1815 and 19 something or other. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's not canon law. That's.
David, would you like to ask a question?
David Jones. Firstly, in relation to production of documents, I'm heavily involved with assisting the Christian Brothers in relation to the Royal Commission. We have produced over 20,000 documents to the Royal Commission, over 20,000. They've had everything that we have got. So there's no question of cover-up or non-disclosure or anything else. I'd like to ask Ian, to what extent is canon law concerned in relation to canonical proceedings, say against a cleric, with trying to protect the position of the person concerned in the event that that person faces criminal prosecution in a criminal court, and it may be sought to use statements or admissions made by the person in the canonical proceedings against the person in the criminal proceedings?
As I understand it, in Australia, if anything is subpoenaed from the church, it will be handed over. I've been subpoenaed twice and have handed over acts of cases of nullity of marriage that have been subpoenaed from the family court in connection with custody and access to children. The background being someone comes and claims a nullity of marriage and alleges their own psychological ineptitude or something, and then the other party to the marriage then tells the lawyer, who says, well, this person has proven in a church forum that he or she was incapable of being normal. How can you trust this person with our children? Whenever I've been subpoenaed, I've understood that I hand the thing over immediately. I've never questioned it, and I can't imagine any. I did hear of a former Archbishop of Sydney back in the late 70s or early 80s being served a subpoena for a church court and quibbled about whether he should or he shouldn't do it, and being advised to hand it over straight away, so he did. It was Cardinal... No, before Clancy. No, Freeman, yeah. Now, I mean, he was a nice man, smoked cigarettes, ate chocolate and didn't drink. But, I mean, there's an example of someone who I thought... I'll say a couple of things about secrecy and canon law in Australia. The joke amongst clergy in Australia is that, you know, we're a long way from the Vatican and we don't take too much notice of canon law. The joke about the definition of what pontifical secrecy in Rome is what you hear in a Roman restaurant being discussed by clerics in the evening. Now, you make what you do of that. But I find it difficult to accept the great reverence that Kieran has for canon law, and especially a mere instruction, not a decree of the Pope, a mere instruction signed by Cardinal Vio in 1974 about, I think it was Vio, who was the Secretary of State at the time, during the pontificate of Paul VI, but Paul VI didn't sign it, and it was an instruction. That's why it's not mentioned in the Code of Canon Law, because it's a secondary thing. We don't take those secondary things too much. People get I mean, we've got this trouble. Some people take liturgical things extraordinarily strictly, and you know, the Pope started washing the feet of women and Muslims last year. Why? Because, and the people who jumped up and down were people who were reading the liturgical text, which again is not canon law, it's secondary rubrics, which are guidelines of what the normal thing, and Canon 18 says the texts have to be read according to their text and context. The context of that washing men's feet goes back to when the rite was taken out of the monasteries in 1956 by Pope Pius XII and put into the Holy Thursday liturgy. And in those days, there were liturgical laws that women couldn't be servers, women couldn't enter the sanctuary and so on. So it was natural, they said, you bring forward 12 men. Since then, the whole context has changed, where we have women as readers and Eucharistic ministers and altar servers and all the rest of it. Why can't you wash their feet? Now, it takes someone like the current Pope to turn around and say the context of this, and I'll show you what to do, and I'll do it myself. Everyone's relaxed about it. But the underlying thing is that it's not a canon that ever did that. It's how we read and how some people take mere regulations and turn them into concrete whatever. Yeah, sorry.
Ian, thank you. There's a question here. Oh, Kieran, sorry.
Can I just read for you what is at the bottom of Secreta Continere? It's in the audience of the undersigned, that's Cardinal Vio, on the 4th day of February in the year 1974, the Supreme Pontiff, Paul VI, approved this instruction and ordered that it be published with the stipulation that it go into force on the 14th day of the month of March the same year, all things to the contrary notwithstanding. Now, if that's not an order from the Pope, I don't know what is.
We're about to have an argument about an order.
Not an argument, it's just the way things are done. I was the acting Vicar General in this diocese on 2 occasions, and you would go to see the Archbishop. One time it was Frank Little, the next time was George Pell, at the end of the day or the end of every few days, and say, this is what's happening. I'm sending out this circular to the clergy and we're making this point and this point. He wouldn't take it into his hands. He gives them, that's what's happened there. That's the way they act. If the Pope wanted it to come in his name, he would sign it and it would be on his letterhead. And it wouldn't be called an instruction. It would be called a papal decree or a motu proprio, which would make it law. Now, you either believe that's the way it's done or it's not. I'm sure that government officials, heads of secretaries of departments in Canberra, say to the Prime Minister, I'm going to do this, but it comes out from them, not from the Prime Minister himself. It's a lower thing and is not meant to be taken any more seriously than a rubric in the Missal, which you use. If I say Mass, I'm supposed to have 2 candles to light. If I said Mass in a hospital ward with oxygen, I wouldn't light the bloody candles.
I've got a question over here. Question here.
I was wanting to ask, now I've got Alzheimer's, I
Kieran.
think. First of all, my name is Joan Windsor, I'm a Dominican sister. I wanted to ask Kieran if he would explain something about the... did you choose the name of the book? Did you choose the illustration on the book? And would you explain it, please? Because it appears to me to be blaming the female.
I can. The illustration on the book is.
Go to the Bible and look it up.
No. Well, I'll tell you about Potiphar in a minute. Oh, you have to read the book to find out about Potiphar. But anyway.
I read some of it.
Okay. Well, look, this cover was done by a very good friend of mine named Michael Mucci, who does illustrations for the Sydney Morning Herald. That photo is actually a photo of his daughter, but he distorted it somewhat. You wouldn't, like, I know her quite well. If I see that, it's not her. But that's what illustrators do. But then he wanted to change it to make it androgynous. It could be either.
Not when you go to the Bible, it isn't.
No, I'm talking about the photo.
Sorry.
I mean, this is a photo of a child,
Yeah.
okay? And, of course, it's got the Vatican seal on it. But the Potiphar's wife came from the claim by Cardinal Bravo of Nicaragua that victims of sexual abuse were like Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar's wife comes from the story of Joseph in Egypt. And you might recall, it's the Joseph with the technicoloured dream coat. He goes to Egypt. He's sold by his brothers as a slave. He goes to work for Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. He rejects the advance, and she grabs his cloak, remember, and then shows it to her husband and said, "He tried to rape me." So exactly. That's exactly, and I've given you 4 instances in there. One of them is actually our former Governor-General for the Archbishop of Brisbane. Remember that public, very embarrassing thing where he said that an Anglican priest, it wasn't rape or anything, it was like the reverse. It was a terrible thing to say. But that was just another one. There's a Franciscan priest in New York who said that priests are seduced by children. And there's another one, a Polish one. So it's actually in the chapter on Potiphar's wife. It explains it.
Thanks, Kieran. There was a question right over in the far corner, the lady over there.
My name's Mary Williams, and I don't really know how to put this question, but as I've listened to the 2 points of view expressed, I want to ask about the question of morality. I want to ask about where does all this law, does it stand under the light of the gospel? Because it's our children, it's our friends, it's our family members who are suffering because of the rigidity and the clever footwork and the clever words and the passing the buck.
I'll offer that question to Kieran first and then Ian.
I suppose the answer to your question is that there is a connection between law and morality, but it's not always the same, as you obviously appreciate. Law is a minimum standard, but I think in relation to canon law, what is really happening here is that a procedure was set in place to deal with this problem, not just this problem, but other problems in relation to what are called canonical crimes. But I don't think it was done very well, and that's why the church is in this mess that it's in.
Do you want to make a comment on it?
So I think the problem is a problem of an amalgam of issues of moral theology, the reality of sin, psychological maladjustment and gross immaturity of certain individuals, the inability of various professionals, not just church professionals, to recognise this. Kieran hinted earlier on that psychologists were saying in the 1980s, I think, that these conditions could be cured. If a bishop was going to take advice, I think some of the bishops he's mentioned in the book took advice from professionals, not from canonists, but from psychologists who said, yes, if this person goes away to some institution, whether he's an alcoholic or a sex addict or a kleptomaniac or whatever he is, there are all sorts of issues of... Well, no, I'm saying that's the psychological sciences. I'm saying it's morality, and there are other things, there are other people who have mucked it up, not just canon lawyers. That's the only point I'm making, and I don't think canon law there's no canon that says something is wrong. There's a process as to how to deal with certain offences. But there's no canon law that says stealing is wrong. That's a fundamental thing that comes from the scriptures or from natural law. Right? So canon law is not saying it's right or wrong to commit sexual sins any more than it's right or wrong to commit any other sins. So my position in this whole thing, I suppose, is that canon law is a distraction. The same as any other science is a distraction. We've got to ask, why do these things happen? And I think it happens because people are sinful or because people are psychologically maladjusted or grossly immature. Now, and I'm not an expert on how you fix those things.
I think that's provoked a few more questions. What if I go over here? Sorry, the man with the beard.
Bob Munro's my name. Mine's a bit similar to that question because as I've listened to you, and this is addressed particularly to you, Ian, as I've listened to you talking about attention to the rules and being aware of definitions, and as I've read the protocols on the Melbourne response and on the Towards Healing, one can sort of get to the point where you think, what's all the fuss about if we're really following what is written down? But I was rather struck in your talk, and as I listened to the bishops, that there is no requirement to be pastoral. What I'm looking for is something that makes people more important than rules. Could you like to comment?
All I would say, things like the Melbourne response and Towards Healing and so on are an attempt to do something other than canon law. I mean, they're not canonical things. They're local attempts. And I haven't been involved in any of that stuff. I'm not a consultant or an advisor for any of those things such as the Melbourne response. But I've always understood it to be some way of, and I presume like anything is going to be flawed or not, everyone's not going to be happy. It gives people an opportunity to tell their story and be listened to, and a recommendation is made to the bishop to do something. Now, that involves people coming forward, that involves people being listened to. I would have thought it was some attempt to be pastoral.
It's not the experience of those who've been abused or their families. There is pastoral content in what is done.
Even at present. Well, I haven't had anything to do with it, so I don't know. All I would know that as a parish priest, I've had to deal with one or two instances in my parish, and I would have got the impression that people thought they were being listened to. Now, I know that there are cases that are reported back where people are not very happy at all, but the things I've had to deal with, and I was told a story only within the last fortnight, this was sex abuse by family members. So really, I haven't had to deal in my parish, and I've been there almost 21 years, with no one has ever come to me and said they were interfered with by a cleric. I don't know what I would have had. It would have been worse if that had happened. Now, I know there are 230 parishes in the diocese, and it happens in a lot of other places. It hasn't happened in my place.
Gentleman over there in the green shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is Dennis Nicol. I'm from Wagga Wagga, possibly apart from Kieran, the only other non-Mexican here this evening. I was troubled by Kieran's book to the extent that I wrote to the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference seeking some form of explanation or rebuttal. What I received I found quite unsatisfactory, as I find unsatisfactory the legal distinctions, the translation distinctions that have been made in challenge to Kieran's book this evening. Some years ago, in a previous existence, I received a letter from the Apostolic Delegate seeking my views on the appointment of a particular individual as a bishop. That letter was guarded by some form of secrecy, possibly even pontifical secrecy. A number of other people also received similar correspondence. Some of us talked about it, but under great fear for what the possible consequences might have been. And my take on what Kieran has written is that whatever you might say about the legalities or the translations, they're operated in the Catholic Church a culture of secrecy that cannot be explained away by fineries of translation.
I suspect that was more a comment. Kieran, would you like to add to it?
No.
Ian?
I mean, I'd agree that there's a culture, but I don't believe the culture's based on canon law. The culture may be more motivated by shame for the community or fear of being sued or whatever.
Kieran?
Just one thing about law and culture. There's a chapter in the book about law and culture where I have discussed the very strong connection between law and culture, and in fact I've based the book on the opinion of Cardinal Francis George in the United States about the intimate relationship between law and culture. Now, one of the problems which I see about this United Nations thing is the pontifical secret is still there. The point that Cardinal George made, and he wasn't talking about canon law, he was talking about civil law. And he said if you wanted to, the United States Supreme Court, in the case of the Board of Education case about discrimination, they knew that if you want to change the culture, you change the law. And if you don't change the law, you don't change the culture. And that's the point which I've made in the book. So long as we have the pontifical secret over child sexual abuse, the culture will never change.
Right down the back there.
Raymond Lopez, Sacred Heart St Kilda. This is Ian, really a question for you, but I'd like to hear Kieran's comments as well. I can appreciate and understand all the subtleties of distinctions as to what's a cleric and the definitions and things of that nature. The reality is this, that monstrous crimes have been committed against thousands of children. Those crimes have been committed while certain popes were there, and they were the people that really were the top people that were supposed to be looking after those children, and those crimes were committed by priests who were accountable to the Pope, ultimately, I would have thought. Two of those popes, one of them has now been canonized, and the other one beatified. Are you able to express a view as to how that is going to be seen by the community at large, how it reflects on the people responsible for those appointments, and does that really devalue the sainthood?
If you've got a personal devotion to either of them, I suppose it may. Well, Kieran holds strongly that those popes all knew exactly what all these underlings were doing. I'm just not convinced. I'm still not convinced that well, I know the popes did not sign most of the documentation, for example. Is it done in their name? It's done in lots of things in Australia are done in the name of the Queen. If you go into a court, the coat of arms is behind the thing. Is she personally responsible for things? Before you start assailing popes, I think it would be a lot more reasonable to start attacking local bishops. I mean, how on earth can the Pope know what's going on in my parish? Would he even know it existed? Should the bishop know what's going on in my parish, he should know that my parish exists, and he's bound to visit my parish every 5 years. He's bound to listen to complaints that come to him about me or the parish, and supposed to investigate things that are perceived to be credible. How many of these things were reported to various bishops, and where they were, and it was mucked up, and I've said it. I said I'm prepared to say that bishops were naive. Some were even negligent, etc. But I don't think it was. Despite what happened about the pontifical secret in Wagga Wagga, I mean, how many people here knew of any pontifical secret before you came here this evening? Well, one's got his hand up. If you read the book, but I mean, in reality, what does it mean? You've heard of cabinet confidentiality. What does that mean? It doesn't apply to me. You know, in theory, that archives will be open in 30 years' time if you want to find out what they discussed at a cabinet meeting this morning. But you won't find out this afternoon unless the fella gets expelled from the cabinet for, not for whatever reason they've got. So with respect, I doubt whether I'd blame the popes. I'm quite ready, but I doubt whether any of those bishops knew anything about canon law any more than the average citizen in Australia knew anything about canon law. There's a healthy disregard for those sorts of things in Australia.
Can I just say something about one of those popes who's about to be beatified? In 1947, there was a priest named Father Gerald Fitzgerald who started an order in the United States called the Servants of the Paraclete. And like a lot of religious orders, it was started because of a particular social problem. The particular social problem in this case were priests who suffered from some sort of substance abuse and those who were sexually abusing children. He sent, after about 10 years, he realised that this whole point of trying to cure them, trying to fix them up, which is why they were being referred to him, was impossible. He sent letter after letter after letter to the American bishops, and you can find that Tom Doyle has got all these letters on, I think it's on Richard Sipes' webpage. Nothing was done. He then wrote to the Holy Office in 1962. Nothing was done. He went to see Pope Paul VI personally, said, "You have to get rid of these priests," and it was ignored.
The lady over with the black cardigan.
Hello, my name is Mary Conlon. I have a question for both our speakers, and thank you very much for your contribution tonight. I have read the book, and I've listened to Ian as attentively as I can at this hour, and I'm thinking, why do I get the feeling that I'm walking on quicksand? That situations that between definitions of law, instruction, regulation, whatever, and looking at the processes that have tried to be implemented in terms of ceasing the engagement of some of these priests, and it's overturned by Rome. Lots of things that I just get the feeling there's mind games going on here. Would you both like to comment, please?
I'll give that to Kieran first.
Well, I'm not sure what the mind games are. I accept I'm not a canon lawyer, But you know, there's an anthropologist who once said that the last people to notice the water are the fish. And I think there is an advantage in someone coming in from the outside and having a look at these things. I don't agree with what Ian says about instructions, because I take my cue not from what I know personally, because I'm not a canon lawyer, but what I read. And in the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law, it says that instruction given is obligatory. Now, if something's obligatory, it means it's a law. Now, he has a different view, and I think we just have to disagree on that. I'm sorry, if that's a mind game.
No, just that the average reader who wouldn't be certainly as well informed as Ian, and that was very interesting, and the research that you have done, Kieran, and then you've got the average person
Sure.
who reads and listens and so on, and you think, so where are we going with all this?
Well, look, can I just say something about the book? Firstly, I didn't write this book for Australia. This is a worldwide problem, and you can see that I've gone through all these different countries, so it's not just about the Australian situation. But the second thing is, I also was not writing a text for canon lawyers. I was trying to explain it to ordinary people. At the same time, I knew that canon lawyers would actually look at it very carefully. So I then made sure that all my sources were there. And there's 860 odd footnotes. If you've got an electronic copy, you can click on them twice and you'll go straight to the URL. Not all of them have URLs, but most of them. So that was my idea. It was not to create... I appreciate some people will find it awfully technical, but law is technical, unfortunately. And I've tried to do the best I can, or I could, to actually explain it.
Ian, do you want to make a comment?
Still working on the presumption that people take notice of law and follow it. And I'm not talking about civil law, I'm talking about canon law. Most people know nothing about it. And what is canon law? It's the in-house rules and regulations for how the Catholic Church is run. Most canon law has to do with the way dioceses and parishes are governed and how each of the sacraments are administered and so on. There's very little, in fact, about regulations that we've been talking about this evening. It's a very small part of canon law. That's one. Secondly, and I appreciate what Kieran says he's writing for the whole world. Well, the problem is Australia is not part of the whole world. And my way of looking at things, the only thing that we can... The only thing we can do is our own experience here in Melbourne or Australia. And, you know, and I tried to say at the start that Australia was exempted from the great bulk of canon law until 1986. So what happens in the... and whether the Vatican thought we were still riding kangaroos up Burke Street, or whether we were all... I don't know, but that was the reality. Therefore, anything before 1986... anything before 1986 was not going to deal with the general canon law of the Church. It was going to be dealt with by the special permissions, indults, faculties and so on that we had in Australia in particular, and for the missions in general.
I've got time, I think, for one more question. There's a gentleman, yes, in the blue T-shirt, with the beard in the blue T-shirt here. Thanks.
My name is Ian Lawther. I'm the father of an abused child. I'm the father of an abused boy. And apart from being totally ignored by every level of the church, from parish priest to the whole office of the Holy See, I have been treated with sheer ignorance and as a self-employed person, I think that the church is on a path to self-destruction because it won't take any notice of the people that got complaints with it. Now, I heard you, Ian, say canon law doesn't affect our life, but I also heard Dennis Hart, who, before the state inquiry, quote Canon Law a couple of times and finish his thing off with better late than never, trying to explain why it took 18 years to get rid of a bloke who was a definite threat to our priests, our kids. Yeah, and the only real close thing I got to being told by the brother of an order was that I was ontologically challenged, and I wouldn't understand. And I still have no idea why. There were 3 pedophiles in my parish, one after the other, and nobody wants to tell me why. Now, I know you can't talk for the church, but surely common decency has to come through somewhere other than quoting Canon Law numbers.
Ian, would you like to comment?
Well, a couple of things I can say. I mean, I'm very sorry and disappointed and so on that your parish priest would not deal with you properly, if that's what you said. I'm not quite sure what you mean by Dennis Hart said about Canon Law.
Dennis Hart quoted Canon Law. He couldn't get rid of a priest any quicker, and 18 years was better than ever.
Well, he can remove there is a process for removing parish priests from office, but it's a.
Well, he obviously didn't want to
I mean, he can invite him to resign. If he doesn't want to resign, then he starts a process. The trouble with some of these things I've heard of is that to get the evidence in any process, people won't come forward and say exactly why what's the man been doing, embezzling funds, raping children, or whatever. And it's like any process. And I mean, you can be up on a murder charge and go to the court, and then a jury finds it not guilty, or it gets a lower thing, or then it goes to an appeal court and it gets overturned. I mean, it's not just the church that is looking for for some sort of level of proof. Now, an allegation is made. I can't speak for Dennis Hutton. I'm not speaking for Dennis Hutton. I don't know really the situation, what you're talking about. But if he said that he can remove anyone who is not functioning properly according to canon law, or according to the gospel, or according to in any normal way. If I had a stroke and couldn't preach and talk, I could be removed if I wouldn't resign, because I'm incapable of functioning as a priest. I'm incapable of preaching the gospel. If a man has a psychological problem, or if a man has lost his good reputation amongst the people by being a pedophile, I can't see why that's not sufficient. But I'm talking in theory. Why it didn't happen in practice in your case, I can't say.
I'm sorry to do this, but time is against us, and I'm going to have to stop the questions now, which I'm sorry about, because I know there are many more questions in the audience. But we do want to give an opportunity for each of the speakers to have a few minutes to do a final recap. And with their agreement, I'd like to move to that part of the evening now. So I'd ask Kieran to start.
Just a couple of other points which I haven't already covered. The reforms of 2001 were, as I understand it, an apostolic letter, a motu proprio of Pope John Paul II. In his revised introduction to that document, Benedict XVI said, "The new law was promulgated in the motu proprio." So that must be a law. The Pope said it was a law, so it had to be. It can't have just been an instruction, which can be ignored.
The 2001 was real law.
Okay, all right. It was real law. Now, secondly, when you actually look at the number of complaints, and when, to adopt Archbishop Colry's term, a tsunami, when did that happen? It wasn't prior to 1986. The abuse occurred prior to 1986. Most of it occurred in the 1970s. A lot of it also occurred in the 1980s. The special committee was appointed in 1988. That's when the problem started to surface, and they thought they had to do something about it, go and put a protocol in, try and get rid of these priests, etc. So this business that somehow or other 1986 wasn't particularly, there was nothing happened, it was just little instructions and we're a missionary country and all this sort of thing, I don't think is all that terribly relevant. Secondly, in 2001, if you actually have a look at the graphs, or not graphs, but tables in the Facing the Truth document, you'll find that of the 618 complaints, that was between 1996 and about, I think it's 2012, 213, 441 were dealt with after 2001, when there was a real law and when the pontifical secret was imposed. Not one of those complaints was reported, according to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, directly by the church to the police. Now, did they ignore canon law? No, they followed it. They didn't report it. There was, in Victoria, there was no obligation to report. They weren't breaching the law, but they didn't report any of these things. Some of them were reported by victims, of course, but the church never did so. Now, the proof of the pudding in anything like this is in the eating. What did they do? They did not report any of them. I accept what Ian says about, in relation to Towards Healing, not so much the Melbourne response, but in relation to Towards Healing, the Australian bishops, well, they didn't ignore canon law, they defied it. And I applaud them for that, because it was dreadful. It was impossible to do anything about it, and they tried to do something about it. But it breached canon law. And I'm not just talking about the secrecy thing. In my opinion, it did breach the secrecy thing. They tried to introduce administrative leave. So what happens? They had priests who were told they go on administrative leave. They appealed to the Congregation of the Clergy. The Congregation of the Clergy says, no, you can't do that. It's not authorised by canon law. We already had the Nestor case in Wollongong. Exactly the same thing. And I might add, those two bishops there deserve a lot of applause. They're prepared to resign as a result of the decision by the Congregation of Clergy. So there was certainly a defiance. But I don't think it was a question of them not knowing what canon law was. They knew what it was, but they were prepared to, we're a long way away, we'll put something else in. But as Professor Parkinson has told them many times, it is useless having a disciplinary system which is not consistent with canon law. And that's been the problem with Towards Healing and all of those things.
Well, there's little more I can say except that in Australia, most people pay little attention to canon law, are not frightened by it, and that's bishops and ordinary people. Most bishops would not know as much. Most bishops would know as much canon law as they learnt in a short seminary course. I did 2 years of canon law as preparation for the ordination for the priesthood, and it had nothing about all this sort of business. It was how we administered the sacraments and how we governed parishes. After 3 years, I was invited or sent away to do graduate studies. That's when I had to learn what canon law was. I'd say the average priest knows practically nothing about canon law, and most bishops in Australia have never studied canon law, and therefore it wouldn't have entered into their brains to consider canon law. All this, what was it, tsunami started in 1988. Well, why did it happen in 88? I don't know. What was it happening in the 1920s or 30s? What happened then? We really don't know. Kieran's has done figures of various cases. I would come back to my original thesis, I suppose, is that dreadful things have happened. I don't think you can blame Canon Law for it from the Australian point of view. Now, if you're talking about Americans in Chicago and the priest with the paracletes and all that sort of thing, they weren't Australians, they were Americans, and they take things very differently to the way we did. There was no equivalent to that ever happening in Australia because we didn't think it was important. That'd be my position.
I actually don't have the task of thanking our speakers. That task falls to Kevin, I believe. And so I'd invite Kevin to come up and add that word of thanks. I would like to add that for me, this evening has perhaps opened up more questions than it's actually answered. And I'm sure that some of you would probably find that the same situation. And so I look forward to more information and perhaps further discussion at a different venue and at a different time. Thank you.
I begin by thanking you for being here tonight and supporting the first collaboration between Catholics for Renewal and Catalysts for Renewal. Your engagement in the conversation has been open and stimulating. We are a troubled people. We have all been challenged by the sexual abuse that has been perpetrated in our church. Some have felt hurt or let down. Some have been angry. Others have been stunned by the facts that such abuse has occurred, that it was allowed to continue, that the response when it came tended to downplay the impact on the children and adolescents who were and remain the victims. Early in this 30-year saga, there was even a tendency to blame the victims. And even now, a small number of parishioners still regard the problem as a media beat-up or only as involving a few perpetrators. The care of children and adolescents who have been abused and their families must be and remain the principal focus for us all. Tonight, the focus has been on the responses and reaction of the institutional church. That is appropriate, as we have to ensure that the evil is rooted out of our church. Over the years, as more and more cases were reported, I could not make sense of it. I wondered how the abuse could have occurred, how the pedophiles could be so cruel, callous and hypocritical. Many solutions have been explored. Some have been implemented, but there is more to do. Like Kieran, I have wondered how otherwise good bishops, men with a genuine pastoral perspective, could have got it so wrong. In his book and tonight, Kieran has explained the background and set out the elements that defined and control the institutional response, namely the imposition of secrecy, the movement of offenders, the non-reporting of crimes, the ruling some 30 years ago to neglect any case that occurred 5 years or more earlier, the treatment of pedophilia as a sin which disappeared after confession, the extraordinary Vatican defence for not laicizing offenders, and the blind obedience imposed on and accepted by bishops as a mark of loyalty. On a point of lesser importance, I was surprised by the various bishops who have appeared before the inquiries when they were so openly critical of their predecessors without providing any context. Kieran has revealed the answer to this and many other questions. The issue of what should remain secret is always problematic. Each of us in our personal interactions, and certainly anyone who has been responsible for a group of people, has become privy to information that ought to be held in confidence. That is, it should remain secret. It is a matter of discernment as to what should remain absolutely secret, as release of the information would do no one any good and would harm others needlessly. But some information needs to be passed on to, say, a manager with line responsibility for a person or an issue. The problem arises when an institution, government, or government department allows or requires a culture of secrecy to develop. Then the protection of reputations becomes central. The institution becomes inward-looking, fails to communicate effectively. Transparency is lost, integrity is compromised, and an exclusive club develops for those in the know. In this way, the institutional church came to distrust the people and to focus on protecting reputations and operating procedures. The justification was the avoidance of scandal, but in the end, the faulty procedures became the scandal. As Kieran and Ian have shown, we have come a long way in dealing with sexual abuse, but the journey is not over. I thank Ian for being here tonight and for pointing out the differential reading and availability of documents in our missionary phase until 1986. The different status of Vatican documents based on the origin is critical, but that is not always conveyed to those of us in the pews. The meaning of the Latin is obviously critical also. It speaks for the need for canonists to find a way of speaking directly to us. Regarding the privilege of the clergy and the church in civil law, that is a distinction that is critical. But will there be a time when the church will be responsible and be able to be sued in civil law? It was pleasing to hear Ian explain that the resort to secrecy cannot be blamed on canon law. That is important. But where does the blame lie? Tonight we have been taken on an insightful, expert journey through aspects of the ways both problems and procedures are handled in the church. Each of us probably would have some aspects handled differently, but we are now acutely aware of the institutional and personnel issues and expect realistic pastoral responses. Please join me in thanking Kieran and Ian for opening up and guiding us through such difficult terrain.